My name's Andrew Hunter Murray, and I'm the author of The Last Day.
Brought to you by the Wilbur and Niso Smith Foundation, the Adventure Society is a book club for adventurous people. In each episode, we try to bridge the gap between an author and their readers. In this episode, we talk to Andrew Hunter Murray, author of The Last Day. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a writer?
Yes. Goes back a bit. So I've been kind of thinking of myself as a writer since I was about 7 years old, but I didn't actually do any writing for a very long time. And eventually in my mid-20s, I realised probably have to actually write something to be considered a writer. So I studied English at university, mostly so I could do more reading, not really for any, academic excellence or anything like that. And I started work at QI, the TV show, and Private Eye magazine. I started working at those both just after coming out of university. I'm still working there now. So I spent a lot of my career around very interesting, fascinating, intelligent, funny people, and just trying to soak up whatever I can from those places, really.
So you said you considered yourself a writer since you were about 7 years old. When do you think you wrote your first story?
Not for a really long time. A lot of authors, they say, God, yeah, I was constantly writing short stories and poems and all this stuff throughout, and I wasn't really. I wrote diaries, which I have not had the nerve to go back and look at, because they're very angsty. That was in my teenage years. I was writing, sort of little funny ideas for things here and there, and started off writing short, funny, sci-fi-ish stories. That was how I got into quote unquote proper writing first of all, and that's the thing that I first showed to the man who became my literary agent, and he said, "These are all right. Can you maybe go away and write a novel?" And so that really provided the impetus I needed, It's a thriller, and it's set a few decades from now in a world whose rotation has ground to a halt. So today, half the world faces inwards towards the sun, and half faces outwards towards the rest of the universe. So life on the sunlit side is tolerable only in this narrow ring where it's not far too boiling hot to live, and where you can still raise crops. This kind of environment. Very fortunately for the plot, Britain is in that narrow sunlit ring, and a lot of the rest of the world, the whole of the American continent almost is in the dark, frozen, cold side, as it gets called in the book. So anyway, that's the idea behind it. I remember it arriving, in my brain. There's nothing I could do about it, and I instantly went away and I just wrote that world for about 6 months. I wrote about what would happen before there were any characters, before there was any story. It was almost like a challenge, Okay, well, what about soil? How would that work? How would crops work? What would happen to agriculture? What happens to this, that, and the other? Do people move into cellars in the hot sunlit region so they can get a bit of darkness? What happens psychologically? All of this stuff. And then I started writing, really without too much of a clue about the story, and came completely unstuck. I wrote about 30,000 words, which is, about a third of a novel, and realised, I haven't actually got a plot here. This is a problem. And I thought, okay, I've written the world, and I haven't done the actual work of writing the story. And some writers do that brilliantly. Some writers go away, they just start writing, they see where they end up. I found out the hard way, I'm not one of those writers. I am someone who plans. And so I went back to the drawing board. I threw away those 30,000 words, and I started working out what the actual story will be, what the plot is.
Can you tell us the story of how The Last Day got published?
Well, once I had a version that was written and that I was pretty happy with, I showed it to my agent, and he suggested a few more changes, and we were getting it closer and closer towards being ready for a publisher to look at it, which is the real moment of truth, as it were. And I got to show it to Susan Sandon, who is the head of Cornerstone, which is a brilliant division of Penguin Random House. And I'd worked with Susan before on the books that we write for the QI podcast, No Such Thing as a Fish. And we were having a celebratory meeting and meal to celebrate the latest book of the year. And I kind of sidled up to her and I said, look, Susan, I've written something which is a bit weirder and a lot more depressing than the book of the year and a bit more fictional. And she said, okay, well, send it over and we'll have a look at it. And I did that, and Peter sent it out to everyone, lots of different publishers, and Susan got back in touch very quickly and said, we like this. And that's the first wonderful moment for an author when it goes from being a Word document to being an unpublished book. And it's a very clear dividing line between the two, and it's a wonderful moment to experience, you know.
Did you have a lot of comments and a lot of feedback, a lot of changes that you had to make?
Yeah, lots. It's amazing. As a first timer, someone who's very new to this, you think, well, I've basically finished it when it goes off to the agent, and then you change it some more, and then you think, well, it's basically done now, and then it goes to the publisher. And then the publishers, even if they like it and they say, we think this is a book and we'd like to publish it, there are so many more layers of changes to make, even before you get to the copy editing and the absolute detail. And it feels daunting, but actually, firstly, you don't know it's going to happen before you get into it, so it's fine. And secondly, it's a sign that your editors are doing their work well, I think. Selena Walker is the editor of this book at Cornerstone. She's absolutely brilliant. Every time an editor or my agent or anybody in the process suggested something, almost every time I said, of course, why didn't I think of that myself? Which is, I think, a sign that you're working with good people. It would be more worrying if they said, great, we've got the manuscript, we'll get in contact with the printers and we'll just send it over, you know. Books are really, really team efforts in a way that is belied by the single name appearing on the front cover.
When you'd finished the manuscript, did you show it to anyone before showing it to your agent?
Yeah, I did. I showed it to a couple of friends who are in the acknowledgements, and they're pretty much the first names in the acknowledgements, I think. And that's a very scary moment as well, because if you're an aspiring writer, people get really protective about their stuff and wanting it to be ready, which is very, very natural. And so I sent it to a friend of mine, the manuscript, and then I went away to Australia, which is a good distance to have from the person who has seen your writing. I recommend it very highly. And then she got in touch with me and told me her thoughts, and some positive, some negative, which is very useful. Negatives almost always more useful than the positives, but the positives are important because they will keep you doing it. So I can recommend that too, but not, maybe don't send it to everybody, don't send it around the group WhatsApp, but having a few people whose reading you trust, and whose sense is the same of what you might be interested in and what they like. I think that's hugely helpful.
The world in The Last Day is our world, but it's in 2059.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no longer our world as we know it. So in building a world like this, how important was the planning in your writing process?
Very important. And it's important because you want to have a world that coheres. It needs to feel like it all fits together as a world. And that's kind of vital for getting the reader's faith and belief in it. That's one of the things I loved about reading, for example, Terry Pratchett as a child, was he'd really put the work into how the world actually works and fits together. And that comes across as comedy because when you have a fantasy world and you take it seriously enough to say, well, okay, how does the Assassin's Guild work? Then it does become funny. It's a wonderful technique he used. So in writing this, which was a bit more serious, I wanted to know that if you accept the main huge premise, which is that the Earth's rotation has slowed to a stop, which is it's a huge thing, you have to do that with as much realism as you can have. And then once the reader has accepted that, then they'll be with you. So I wrote to a friend of mine who's an astrophysicist, and I asked her for advice about how you would stop the world from spinning in the first place. And she consulted her colleagues, and they sent back this brilliant list of ways you could do it, mechanisms that might be sufficient to slow down a planet's spin, things that would be that big and serious. So yeah, and then you want to know that the government fits together. You want to know who's doing the farming in this society. You want to get all of that. And it's weird because it is a book set in 2059, as you say, but really it's such a broken down world that it may as well be the 1970s. It's not a world where there's new technology that you can see around you. Really, it's a world which has regressed, and it's kind of like those conspiracy thrillers of the 1970s in the feel of it. Yeah, so that's the vibe that I wanted to get across.
And in terms of the story itself, did you know all the ins and outs of the story before you started writing?
I did by the time I started writing it the second time round. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I wanted to build it to a kind of climax. The reason I keep looking down here is because I actually got my copy down here, and I tried to balance it on the case behind me, but magnificently it doesn't fit the hardback. So you see, it just kind of doesn't quite fit onto the shelf. So anyway, yes, but I wanted to have something that had quite tightly plotted beats and something that was taking place over the course of a single week. And the story does take place in the course of a single week with various, flashbacks, memories, this kind of thing. So yeah, it was quite important to me that it all, where's our main character here? What's she doing when she goes here? Who does she see next? That kind of thing.
That brings us quite nicely onto your central character. How would you describe Dr. Ellen Hopper?
Ellen Hopper is an oceanographer. She is resourceful but reserved. She emotionally is in an absolute deep freeze since she left Britain several years ago to work offshore on an ex-oil rig in the North Atlantic. It's quite hard to talk about her because I'm so fond of her, and I'm so worried about what she would think of me getting her character wrong or describing her incorrectly, because she's quite a frosty character in lots of ways. And this is actually the friendlier version of Hopper I wrote in exchange to some early notes from publishers saying she's quite mean, isn't she? Yeah, she's running away, as lots of people in this New Britain are, from various kinds of trauma in her past, and that's what took her to the rig in the first place. And so the story is one not only of her coming back to the British mainland and starting to unravel this huge secret about the state as it is today, but it's one of her re-engaging with the world emotionally and with herself. It's basically her thawing out as a person and seeing what put her in the deep freeze in the first place that I wanted to do. So that has to be stitched in and balanced against the progress of the adventure as it's going on. And that's, I think, one of the trickiest things to do, is to have that balance. Here you give a bit more detail about Britain. Here we find out a bit more about Hopper. Here we have a bit more of the story happening. And if those weave together nicely, then you can get something good going on.
I also found it interesting that you call her predominantly throughout the novel, you call her Hopper, which immediately made me as a reader feel closer to her, as if we're on nickname terms.
Interesting, yeah.
And I wondered, is there a reason that you chose to call her by her surname?
I think it is something like that, but I think it's also a kind of formality hangover in another weird way. It's people aren't really on first name terms with her because she has kept to herself in a lot of her environments. So yeah, it's weirdly, some people call her Hop as a kind of, and those are people who are her friends and do know her on nickname terms. It's also probably a slight inadvertent tribute to Ripley from the Alien films, who is, only ever known really by her surname, and who you might notice is also called Ellen. So I think there was a lot of that in there too.
How important to the story itself do you think are the secondary characters?
Oh, I mean, hugely. So the secondary characters at the start of the novel, she's summoned back from this frostbitten North Atlantic rig to the mainland to see Dr. Edward Thorne, he taught her at university, and he is one of the people who built this nation. Really, he was hugely involved in the formation of the new British state several decades ago. He then left in very unclear circumstances and started teaching at a university where he met Ellen. So she's summoned back to see him as he lies dying, and we don't know why he's asked to see her. We don't know what he wants to tell her. That becomes part of the story. There's her ex-husband, David, who they never quite made it work, partly thanks to the experiences of her early life. So there are all these other characters knocking around who, without them, you don't really have a story, and they have to be almost as real and almost as closely imagined as Hopper is. Obviously, you're seeing the story through Hopper's eyes, so you're getting much more insight into her character. The way she describes the things she's seeing is vital. So you're seeing a bit less of the other characters, but no, they've got to be as real.
I think that a good novel can often change the way that you think about something, or it can allow you to see something from a different perspective. Did you write The Last Day with any connection between the novel and what is happening in the world today in mind?
Yes, I mean, entirely. It's really a story about a Britain which is suffering from a very changed climate, both in terms of the actual climate, the weather, and in terms of the political climate. So it's an attempt to write about the things that that Britain is wrestling with today, its own past, its potential future, the idea of migration, the idea of people wanting to live in this country, and Britain's attitude to those people. Those are all things that I wanted to come across quite strongly in the book. And I think writing it as an adventure story is a way of getting to write two books in one, really. I wanted to write something that you could read purely as an exciting adventure about a very changed world, or as a kind of dreadful parable of the world we're in today. So I think that's why I wanted to do both.
This is really a dystopian depiction of our world in a near future, and a large proportion of it takes place in London, although a very different London to the one that we know. I'm quite used to talking to historical fiction writers and asking them how they make their settings feel so authentic. But how do you?
Well, I like to find a landmark that is beloved and that everyone has a clear sense of in their mind's eye, and then I destroy it in an unusual or interesting way. So,
Very different kind of research.
actually, the lovely thing that happens in The Last Day, I don't know if you can see this clearly, but the inner pages of each cover, the beautifully rendered artwork shows you a London which is trashed in lots of ways, and they kind of took their inspiration from a few of the things I'd described. I think there is a German word called I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something like Ruinen and Kampfenheit, or something close to it, which describes the love of ruins. And I think the idea that the ruins of something beautiful are even more beautiful than the original thing was, and that's something that you can see in historical novels. There is, I think, a universal love of ruins and a love of wanting to see what things would be like if things went wrong. That has a very powerful pull on the human imagination, and brilliant sci-fi authors, people like John Wyndham, have done a wonderful job of rendering these worlds real. So what I was trying to do was, take the world we know and show us just enough of it to make it familiar, but changed enough to make it unsettling.
There are some great segments of action within the novel. And I think you've interspersed that really well with kind of the description and the really feeling, the feel of being immersed in the world that you've created. And one I can think of in particular is when, towards the end of the novel, when Hopper and David are on their drive out of Oxford, and they're being chased and they feel like the enemies are closing in on them, and the tension really mounts and there's other obstacles that are put in their path. Do you have any tips for writing action?
Oh, goodness. I think having this again sounds incredibly basic, but the only thing I would say is to have a very clear idea of what is going on in a 6 feet radius from the scene that you're describing. And the beauty of writing is that you can slow things down as much as you like. So a lot of people use him as an example, but the way Lee Child writes a fight scene is actually quite slow. He really takes his time working out exactly what is happening there. If Jack Reacher punches someone, you get to know, you get a very clear sense as the reader of what is going on. And so not being afraid to take your time with the events of a scene, I think, is maybe one good way of writing action.
Would you call this an adventure story yourself?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of describing it. Actually, it's meant to draw you in and pull you along. It's ideally I wanted people to keep reading and not be able to stop. I think they have to know they have to find out what happens. So yes, adventure is perfect. I mean, I'm terrible at describing books in terms of genre. I love to get away from genre. I think it was Kazuo Ighiguro. He was interviewed, and I think it was somewhere like the Paris Review. He said, what are we talking about genre? What is this genre thing? What is this weird albatross of genre that we've all hung around our own necks willingly? It's very useful for all sorts of things, for booksellers and for publishers and for everybody. But if you're writing, I think the more you can get away from genre, the better.
Are there any particular books or authors which have made a lasting impact on you?
Yeah, loads. Well, I'd have to narrow it down. Well, two of the big inspirations for this book certainly were Robert Harris, who, no one writes a thriller like Robert Harris, and a thriller with an interesting setup behind it, a fascinating premise. And the other was P.D. James. I like her crime novels a great deal, but her book, The Children of Men, in a world where no babies have been born for 21 years, was a huge influence on me. Again, because that's writing about a kind of scrappy, decrepit Britain. And I think there's a powerful part of the British imagination that deals in decline. I don't know what that is. I don't know whether it's a post-imperial thing. Who knows what recesses of the British imagination it comes from. But there is a fascination with, what if this is all over? So those were two authors who really influenced me. But yeah, I mean, dozens. I try and preserve time at the beginning of the day when I certainly feel fresher and more creative. If I can get in an hour or two of writing each morning before the working day begins, then I feel like I'm much better able to produce fiction and new ideas then. And maybe after the working day, I'll be able to go back and review. But by that point, my brain's pretty much mush. So it's not really good for the work of coming up with new scenes, new characters, forging connections between things, that kind of stuff. So that's the only routine I've got. But that it is, I think, important to say, writing for half an hour a day is much better than writing for 3 hours once a week. Because it's a muscle like any other, and if you use it regularly, then you'll feel so much more confident and able to just get in the groove, even on days when the muse, if you like, is missing. It doesn't matter. You don't need the muse because you've got the muscle. That's the motivational saying of the day. Yep. And it's important to say I fail at this all the time. I frequently procrastinate, or I say, maybe I'll just do a bit more research reading today. It's the only difficult seconds are the 5 seconds before beginning, but those 5 seconds can sometimes last for a couple of hours if you let them. If you want to write a book, then getting to the end of a first draft is a fabulous achievement, and it can be changed after that. I mean, the difference between the first and the final drafts of The Last Day is pretty big, but I wouldn't have got there without having that first draft that then turned out to need all those changes.